y'all, it's Ashley Bookish Rum, and I'm here with another video. No special intro today. I am just so exhausted today, but I'm here to do, as you can see by the title, my mid-month wrap-up, which is so crazy because I feel like I just did a wrap-up, which technically I did just do a wrap-up, but that wrap-up was extremely long. It was over an hour long. I just don't want to do that again, so we're gonna try just back to doing my mid-month and my final wrap-ups and see how that goes. And if they still end up being too much, then I will consider possibly doing a weekly format. So we'll see. I just want to do a method that's not going to create too much work on my end. But anyway, mid-month wrap-up. I think I have read about 19 or 20-ish books so far this month, but please take into consideration that a few of these are on the shorter end, and I do have some picture books that are included in here. So while that number does seem super elevated, there's reasons behind why that number it appears to be so high right now. So we're going to go ahead and jump into the books. I'm going to go in chronological order, and then what I'll do is, in going in chronological order, if it is part of the series, I will just like talk about the series as a whole, because I think there's a couple in here that are all kind of linked together. As always, if you're looking for a detailed review of any of these books, they are on Goodreads, also on Storygraph. I think I should start linking my Storygraph now, because what I do is I work within both. I just write a review probably on Goodreads first, and I just transfer all the information over into Storygraph. It's now become a habit, which is really, really good. So you can follow me on either one of those, whatever your preference may be. All right, so now for the books. So the first book that I have finished in January so far is Apartment 103, and this is by Stephanie Shea. This is a short novella, like 25-26 pages, that I actually found because of a Discord group that I'm in. It was dropped as a part of a title that was on sale or for free. I think I ended up getting it for free, and I read it clearly in one setting. It is about two characters, Logan and Natalia. Logan has seen Natalia in their apartment complex for a very long time. She lives in 103, and Logan just has been fascinated with her, is just into her, but she doesn't know if Natalia is into her, and it just literally just chronicles them kind of meeting and it going from there. I thought that this was a good start. I thought that the author's writing was very, very well done. It is written in second person, so I will say that that may be an element that some readers are not used to, and I can definitely understand how it could take the reader out of the story, but I do at the same time understand what the author was going for in writing it in second person. I think that this was a good way to check out some of Stephanie's writing and what she's going for, and that I think that most of her stories I need to double check, but I think that she is specifically writing queer romance. I think. I could be wrong, but I think, and I believe that she just released a full-length novel, so this is a good starter kind of book to figure out whether you'll like her writing or not, and I'm definitely interested in checking out more of her stuff, and I ended up giving this one a 3.5. The next one that I have here is a picture book, and is I Am Not a Number, and this follows Irene and her family, and they are part of the Nipissing First Nation, which I'm probably saying that so wrong. And what ends up happening is her and her family are just living their life until a government agent comes and takes Irene and her two brothers away to this, what they, I believe, is called a residential school is the name for it. And what happens at this residential school is they attempt to erase the cultural backgrounds of these indigenous students. They are treated cruelly. They cut their hair, which is so horrible, because as Irene describes in this book, the only time that her or her family members ever cut their hair was in times of grieving, and it was just really hurtful and very embarrassing for that to have happened. And this really just details the traumatic experiences that a lot of indigenous groups went through whenever their children were sent to traditional schools, and how a lot of these children end up losing their sense of identity because they can't fit in with the white community. I mean, there were aspects of this book where you had teachers telling the students to wash the brown off of their skin. Like, you know that these things happen, but reading about them never ever takes the shock away. And I think that this is a very important and informative picture book that lets you know just a glimpse of what it was like for these students to go to these residential schools. Now, this is actually based on a true story, which is, I think that the author, Jenny, I believe that this was her grandmother or her great grandmother, one of the two. So this is her actually writing from that particular experience. I highly recommend it. There's a lot of detailed information in this book. I absolutely love the artwork, and I would definitely recommend, if you do pick this up, to make sure that you check out the information about the residential school system as well as the afterword by the author. And I ended up giving this one 4 out of 5 stars. All right, so the next book that I ended up reading was Imaginary Friend by Stephen Chbosky, and this is one that I read as a part of a benefit for one of the tiers of Patreon. So the person who chose this book will be getting a more in-depth review, a more detailed spoiler-filled review than what I'm going to say here. But this is probably a book that I would consider to be extremely polarizing, because people either really seem to like enjoy it, or people just seem to like not like it at all, which I understand why. This is a book about a young boy and his mother who are escaping an abusive relationship, and they move to this small town. And the young boy, Christopher, actually ends up going missing for, I believe, like 6 days. And when he goes missing, he comes back, and then these strange things start happening, and it appears that Christopher has this imaginary friend that he's in communication with, which makes the first half of this book really spooky and creepy, especially if you kind of listen to it on audiobook. This is a chunky book, so the audiobook, I believe, is like 24 hours long, but it definitely has a horror, creepy element in the first half of the book. I think where the transition happens for a lot of people is the second half of the book is written very differently from the first half of the book. In fact, when you read the book, it's almost going to feel like you're reading 2 different books, because the intent and the writing style and the purpose of the book does change in the second half. I think I had one kind of viewpoint of where the book was going in terms of why Christopher came back, like very changed. In fact, when he was just in the town before going missing, he actually had a lot of different issues. He struggled in school a lot. He actually had a lot of trouble reading. And then when he came back and he reappeared, which he reappeared and said that the nice man helped him out of the woods, and that's all he can kind of remember. And then there's this obsessive behavior that kind of happens, which I don't want to say too much about because it takes away from the beauty of the story itself. However, by the time you transition to the second half of the book, what elements you were seeing and what assumptions and the almost paranormal feel that you got in the first half of the book doesn't translate over to the second half of the book. But I still think I like the overall theme that Chbosky was going for in the second half of the book. It does take this wild turn, and I do feel like it was a little too long, because you had this huge kind of standoff between this one force and Christopher and some people in the town, and you feel like when the big reveal happens, which I was genuinely like surprised by the big reveal, you feel like when they have their huge last grand standoff that the novel should end. But Chbosky writes it in a way that it just keeps going. So this book could have been another, like, it could have been 200 to 300 pages less than what it was. I think there was a certain point in which the novel definitely could have reached a final like conclusion, but it just kind of kept going. So I know that for a lot of people it just kind of drew the experience out, but I stuck with it and I really did like it. I actually ended up giving this one 4 stars, and I really could see where he was going with this book, and that this book kind of did translate a little differently than what people expected. I think the expectations weren't there, but this conversation of good and evil was just very, very, very fascinating. His take on it was very, very fascinating. Okay, so the next 2 that I'm going to talk about together, because I read 2 volumes of this manga, and of course no one should be surprised. It is Drops of God Volume 3 and Volume 4. They were absolutely amazing. I don't want to say too much about them because they are Volumes 3 and Volume 4 within the series, but if you've never heard of Drops of God before, it is a manga series that specifically focuses on wine, which I didn't think I was going to like, because while I am a wine drinker, I've never had true interest in how wine is made, the different types of grapes that it comes from, even down to like the way the terrain is kept in order to grow the grapevines and stuff like that. I just was not really that interested. I mean, wine is wine to me. If it's good, it's good. But this definitely has sparked my interest in a completely different way. It is very much so about the history and the technical stuff that goes behind wine. However, it is not dry. It is not like academic. It does talk about very specific things, very specific types of wine, specific vineyards and regions that wine come from, specifically looking at, I think the 2 countries that I've seen so far mainly discussed are France and Italy. I think Cali has been brought up just a little bit so far, but this actually is more than that. It's not just, oh, we're just going to talk about wine. It focuses on a character by the name of Shizuku, who has a father that is a very, very well-known wine critic. His father passes away, which is not a spoiler. It happens in the first volume. It's in the description. And what ends up happening in this is that he leaves behind a will. And of course, he goes to collect his father's will. But what he didn't realize is that his father had adopted another wine critic in the making by the name of Issei or Isai. I'm not sure how to say his name, but he has been adopted. Therefore, he actually is within his rights to have access to the will as well. And what his father did was create a competition. So they are to find the 12 apostles and the drops of God, which is like the top wines that his father has within his collection. And the 2 of them are competing not only to get his estate as far as like his house, but also to get that specific collection, which is a highly, highly, highly valuable collection of wine. And they have these hints that are supposed to kind of give them an idea of where to go. So that's kind of like the overarching plot of this whole thing. But each volume also includes different subplots, which I think are really, really cool, like different challenges. So you see things like them having to compete at a wine tasting. They've had to help a restaurant owner. The volume that I just read, they actually, and when I say they, I mean Shizuku and his friend Miyabi, who is trying to become, I believe it's called a wine sommelier. I think that's the name for it. Do not quote me on that. But they work together, and he's a part of this beer and wine company. And one of the challenges that they had to do in volume 3 and 4 was compete on whether they were going to use either Italian or French wine for the company. And you just meet these full cast of characters who are all fun. They're really, really enjoyable to read about. And volume 4 ended on such a huge cliffhanger, because that is the volume in which we officially get the first clue for the first like apostle wine. And it literally is just a description that came to mind when his father drank this specific wine. So it's crazy the way that it ended, because I was like, what? That's it? So I already have volume 5 checked out. I haven't started it yet, but I gave volume 3 4 stars and volume 4 5 stars. The next thing that I read is one that actually does not come out until the 19th. So this will be coming out before this book actually releases. And this is Remote Control by Nadia Corfor, which is a new novella that she has releasing. And this is about a young girl by the name of Fatima. Her initial name is Fatima. And then something happens and she acquires these strange abilities that help her glow. And when she glows, she can basically wipe out like anybody within the vicinity if she doesn't control that glowing power. And when the initial incident happens, she doesn't remember her name and she becomes Sankofa. So what's interesting about this one is that Sankofa is very much so isolated, and it's told in an interesting way. So the first few chapters, I'm gonna say first few chapters, I feel like it's like the first 1 or 2 chapters, we're getting Sankofa in the present, and then we backtrack and realize how she went from Fatima to Sankofa and how she acquired these powers. And then what's so dynamic about this is that I don't think you ever really learn where these powers come from. You know that they are in sci-fi in nature, meaning they're coming from some type of being, probably alien-based powers, but you don't know because I don't think that question ever truly gets answered. But I feel like this is a case study of humanity, and this is a lot darker than I think I expected it to be, because as a child she gets these powers, she can't control them, she doesn't understand them, and because of this power she becomes very much so ostracized and isolated when word gets out about her abilities. And it's kind of hard seeing a child actually go through what she goes through. So she encounters people who are really nice to her and want to take her in, and then people who are really cruel. And what I liked about Sankofa as a character is that she has such grace about her in terms of how much she experienced in terms of grief and being ostracized, and how much she has built this harmony between herself and nature and building this companionship with nature, because she has been so isolated that she has no choice. And you feel for her and you root for her because of the fact that you know that she's experienced so much trauma, and it's literally a child just wanting to belong somewhere to someone. But it's kind of hard when you're associated and known as like the adopted daughter of death, of the angel of death. So it's kind of hard to really talk about this without spoiling a great portion of it. I've talked to Chloe about this. We've talked a little bit about this book, and she informed me that this is probably related to Who Fears Death, specifically the second book in that series. So because one existing entity in this book has made an appearance in the other book, but I definitely now want to read the series and see if there was any type of interconnectivity that goes, and see where Nnedi Okorafor is actually going to go with this story as a whole. But I did end up really enjoying this one. I gave it 4 stars. I think that this is a great gateway if you're starting to read more science fiction. That was one of my unspoken goals too for this year, is to read a little bit more science fiction, a little bit more Afrofuturism. So this definitely was a great read for me. The next book that I read was another picture book, and it is C is for Country by Lil Nas X. And this literally is just what we call a concept book. So concept books are books that teach children things like numbers, shapes, colors, etc. And this is a concept book that specifically goes through the alphabet, but in the true fashion and form of Lil Nas X. I'm glad that he was able to have a lot of creativity with this one. I did enjoy the artwork. I loved the family dynamic that is mentioned in this book. I think that he had a lot of fun. This just was a great way for him to reiterate the importance of just wanting to be yourself and knowing that it's okay to be yourself and enjoy what you want to enjoy and love what you want to love. And I'm happy that this book exists. Baby girl and I have read this book about 2 times, and I'm sure it's one that we'll continuously read a little bit more as she gets older. This one should already be out by now, so definitely check this one out if you have little ones, and I ended up giving this one 4 out of 5 stars. So the next book books that I read, I didn't read them in order, but I'm going to talk about them together because they are a series, and that is the Filthy Rich American series by Nikki Sloan. I have talked about the third one a little bit in my 48-hour reading vlog Gone Wrong. This is such an interesting series. It is made up of 3 books. The first one is The Initiation. The second book is The Obsession. And the third book is The Deception. Like I had said in that vlog, I do have the 4th book in the series. I just have not read it yet. And these books are about 2 rich American families in which we have Maris and Royce, who are not supposed to be married initially. It was supposed to be Royce and Maris's older sister who were supposed to get married because it was going to look good for the company, and it had been kind of an agreement that the families had already come up with. But then things go wrong, Emily gets pregnant, and then it's down to Maris and Royce getting married. And Maris had a encounter with Royce when she was younger, not like super young, but like a year prior to the events of the book, and she finds him to be really cold. He's just not a nice person. He's a Hale, and they are known for being very cold individuals, so she's just not really looking forward to it, although she's extremely curious because they had that one encounter at a party, and he clearly finds her attractive, she finds him attractive. So anyway, there is some really crazy elements about this book, and honestly it is very hard to talk about this series as a whole without going into some spoilery aspects of it, so I really don't want to give away too much. My entire reading experience of this, I started the first book and I thought, oh my gosh, this is just gonna be another plain Jane romance where we have a girl fall in love with a bad boy who has money, they both have money, whatever, and I was like, this is just gonna be dry. I was very wrong, so wrong about that. So with the first book, with the title The Initiation, you actually find out like what the initiation means. And oh my goodness, I just don't even, I just can't even begin to explain to you like how wild that is. So just looking at the series as a whole, for me, I think that Nikki Sloan is a good writer in terms of plot. I think that she can write a plot in the craziest ways. I think that her creativity and what she's able to come up with is something that I will admire. I just am not a huge fan of her characterization. So I read these 3 books specifically for the anti-hero of the book, who is McAllister, who is Royce's father. He is that character that you love, that you know you are not supposed to like. Like, you should not like him, you shouldn't enjoy him, but my goodness, I enjoyed everything related to McAllister because he's a sick SOB. Like, oh my goodness gracious, he really is. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I think that he pushes characters to their limit, and I think that he doesn't understand what the point of limitations are or what boundaries are, but he just had this, I don't know, this vibe about him that I know that I shouldn't have enjoyed it whatsoever. But I was not a fan of Maris and Royce. Like, I just didn't care. It wasn't a huge thing for me. I thought that Royce wasn't a good person either. As much as Maris did not like McAllister, I felt like Royce was doing some of the same behavior, especially in the 3rd book. There was a real reveal about something that Royce had done, and I was like, I mean, that's just as bad as his daddy if you want to be honest. But I get that, I got how everything was going to line up and how things were going to go down. So I ended up giving the first book 4 stars. I gave the second book 3.5 stars, and I gave the third book 3.5 stars. I'm probably going to end up really rating the 4th book pretty high because it's just about McAllister. And that's what I'm here for. But overall, this was a solid series so far. I'm looking forward to seeing what else Nikki Sloan has to offer. The next one that I have is The Awakening of Malcolm X, and this is written by Ilyasa Shabazz and Tiffany D. Jackson. And I got a review copy of this one, and it is already out. It came out on January 5th. And this is about Malcolm X's time that he spent in prison. So Ilyasa Shabazz also wrote the book X, and X happens chronologically before the events of The Awakening of Malcolm X, but they can be read as standalones. I think that if you want a more YA version of the events of his life, then I would read them in chronological order, because he also has done Betty Before X, which is about her mother, X, and then this one, The Awakening of Malcolm X. So I would just read them in that order if you want the full experience. I have not read X. I do have a copy of it, and I do plan on reading it because this one was absolutely phenomenal. This was my first 5-star read for 2021, and I love this one because the way that it was structured is that we got flashbacks of Malcolm X's life as he was in prison, and he was going through this process of literally awakening himself and going back to the roots that his family, specifically his mom and his dad, had instilled in him, in learning what it meant to truly be a black man in America. So if you didn't know, Malcolm X actually ends up in prison because of the fact that he was a part of a robbery that took place, and he went to go get the watch that he stole. He went to go get it repaired, and it had been reported as stolen, so he got in trouble. And when he got to court, he actually had been in a relationship with a white woman, and she flipped the script while they were in court, and he ended up, I believe, getting anywhere in between 8 to 10 years. I think he served at least 8 years, if not more. And it literally is about the experience of him being a black man and being in prison and encountering other prisoners and people talking to him about their own experiences and how it's pushing him to go back to where he used to be. It is about his conversion over to the Nation of Islam and his family's involvement in the Nation of Islam. And what I thought was very unique about this is that, of course, Malcolm X eventually, if you know the story of Malcolm X, if you know anything about his life, he ends up breaking away from the Nation of Islam in a lot of ways. He doesn't break away from being a Muslim, but he kind of has like a falling out with the Nation of Islam. And what I thought was very unique about this, because I didn't think that this novel was going to do it, is that it hints at that next stage of his life in which he would fall out with the Nation of Islam. And it was through another character, which I did not expect, with him saying, you know, you should be mindful of any type of religious entity that puts one man on a pedestal and kind of reveres him in a way where he could do no wrong. And he was specifically talking about the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, of course, and how that situation ends up going. I do like that this book covered a lot of different topics, especially like the treatment of black bodies, specifically black bodies while they're in prison. And there was a certain situation in which Malcolm went from a prison that was just, I mean, there was no hidden racism between the guards and the prisoners. Like, the guards who were white did not get down with the black prisoners at all. There was a lot of physical harm and violence that happened. There's a lot of suicidal ideation, so I would be mindful of that. There's actual suicide, and just, it's the treatments that happens in that one prison and then compared to when he was transferred to another prison. So right before Malcolm X leaves that prison is like when his awakening process truly begins. And then you see him transferred to this other prison, which was it wasn't minimum security, but the method in which they attempted to rehabilitate their prisoners was a lot different. So they offered them courses, they could be part of music classes, they could be a part of debate teams. There's a lot of different elements for them to take a part in to better their lives. And you know, of course, this is when Malcolm really like found himself in terms of like reading everything that he could get his hands on, copying words from a dictionary, being a part of that debate team. What Ilyasa and Tiffany D. Jackson did such a good job of is showing that even though the second prison kind of created an environment where the prisoners had more flexibility, there was still hidden racism amongst the black prisoners and the guards, no matter how good things may have seemed. Because when Malcolm started to progress too much, when he started to become too smart for his own good, when he was on the debate team and was really challenging the words and wisdom of his white counterparts, people started to have a problem with that. It was a black man becoming too educated, and I loved how they highlighted that. And there's one particular quote that I actually loved from this book that I wrote down in my notebook that I'm actually picking up, and I shared this on Twitter, and I think it's super applicable to what we're talking about now. And the quote is, "It's hard to imagine a world that considers us equals when the core of our very existence is human and they don't consider us that." So I think that was a theme that they were going for. It was just really good. It was a really great book. If you are looking at some way to learn a little bit more about Malcolm X, if you haven't read the autobiography of Malcolm X, I definitely would recommend checking this out. But like I said, be wary of the content warnings for this book, which include use of the N-word on page, mistreatment of Black prisoners, of course, the violence against Black prisoners, death, suicide, suicidal ideation, drugs, gambling, and of course racism on page. The next thing that I read is another picture book, and this is Chester Nez and the Unbreakable Code, a Navajo code talker story, and this is by Joseph Bruchac. I read something by Joseph Bruchac last year, which was his middle grade book, The Skeleton Man, which was so creepy. Still questioning how that was a middle grade book, but whatever. So I saw that Joseph Bruchac has written quite a few picture books and other children's books, and I decided to start with this one. And this is about the true story of Chester Nez, who is a part of the Navajo Nation, and how it describes his experience, once again, like in the other picture book that I talked about, him being sent to traditional school and how they told him that he needed to learn how to basically forget his traditions, forget how to speak the Navajo language, and he refused to. He wanted to make sure that he kept himself intact with his traditions and with his specifically with his cultural traditions, and it came in handy. So eventually what ended up happening is during World War II, the United States was having issues with being able to send messages to soldiers, and the codes that they were using kept getting cracked. Like, I believe that both the Germans and the Japanese were effective at cracking their codes. So what they did is they reached out to members of the Navajo Nation and asked them if they would be willing to serve, and they were responsible for creating this code in which they were able to communicate different information, and then they would serve in the military and XYZ as the story goes. I think for me, one of the most difficult aspects of this book is knowing, literally, as it says in this book, like Chester knowing that the United States government at one point was at war with the Navajo Nation, but when it came down for him to serve time in the military, he looked at himself as being a part of America and being an American and wanting to do right by his country. And it's just one of those things where it's like, it's so amazing that marginalized groups, specifically Native and Indigenous groups who have been nothing but oppressed by the US government, will still, and have in US history, have, you know, served, have willingly served, have done their duty to serve this country. And it's just amazing that, like, in situations like this, like, I know that this is not information that's traditionally taught in school. This was my first time ever hearing about the Navajo code talkers. Like, I didn't even know that that was a thing in World War II. And I do understand that every aspect of history can't be taught in one academic year, but I feel like more BIPOC stories and narratives need to be a part of mainstream US history that is taught, especially in our K-12 environments. And, you know, for the longest time, they couldn't even really truly be honored because it was such a secret operation that until it became declassified, that was when the rest of the world found out, and that was when they were honored. And, you know, they were honored on a national level, but it's not a story that we hear much about. And I really enjoyed it. I wasn't a huge fan of the art. I like artwork in picture books, and this is just a personal preference. It's not going to lessen your enjoyment of the actual text and the story itself. But for me, visually, when it comes to picture books, I like artwork that's a little bit more actually, like, defined, if that makes sense. So if you want to know about a little nugget of World War II as it relates to the Native and Indigenous community, I definitely would recommend checking out Chester Nez and the Unbreakable Code. The next one that I ended up reading was How to Fail at Flirting, and this is by Denise Williams. And this is kind of one of those covers, again, that I think is a misleading. I don't know if it's truly misleading. It probably isn't really misleading, but I think that when I saw this, I was like, oh, this is going to be like a cute rom-com book, and it is definitely not just cute and funny. It definitely deals with some harder topics, so I will say that, you know, going into this book, check for content warnings. The ones that I was able to identify were abuse, specifically emotional, verbal, physical abuse, also revenge porn, and of course it is a romance. There is strong sexual content in this book, and there also is a level of gaslighting as well. So if you cannot tell, this book does highlight some elements of an abusive relationship, but it is mainly about our two characters, Naya, and I always want to say Naya Papaya because that's what Jake calls her. Jake is our hero throughout the entire book. So every time I go to talk about this book, I'm like, Naya Papaya, and I'm like, stop, like, her name is Naya. You want to call her Naya Papaya because that's what Jake called her, and that's not your relationship. But yes, so it's about Naya and Jake. Naya is a professor at a university / college, and she is trying to move on with her life because of the fact that she had gotten out of an abusive relationship, and her friends are trying to help her move on. They help her create a list, and she has these tasks that she's supposed to do, and she meets Jake at a bar, and it starts off as a casual fling, and of course it develops into so much more. So there were a couple of different elements that I did like about this book. I was afraid that I wasn't going to be able to make it through this book because I thought that it was going to be particularly triggering for me. However, it was not as bad as I thought. There were some parts that were difficult to make it through where I just had to pause and kind of take a break, but for the most part I kind of did okay with it in terms of that. But I liked that Denise Williams wrote this book very, very well in terms of handling that aspect of the conversation about abuse. And there was a specific element that I kind of related to a lot, where we don't see Naya go through therapy after being in an abusive relationship. And I think sometimes that correlation is missed, and sometimes we don't have that conversation about how important that is to deal with the after effects of being in an abusive relationship. Because, and I'm speaking in terms of experience here, I'm not just speaking out my backside, although I'm not speaking for everyone. I do think that there is an element of PTSD or PTSD like symptoms that occur after being in an abusive relationship, and you can see that in Naya, just in certain ways that she behaves and moves and how she reacts to certain situations, and how her thought patterns, because you do get her internal thoughts, and how she views Jake in the beginning and certain things that she does in correlation to Jake. It does very much so believe me to think that there were some elements of PTSD or just straight PTSD, although it's never said, I don't think, on page, and that therapy is a big component that helps you move past that. But I think that it was nice seeing a situation in which Naya was able to look forward to being in a relationship where she could trust her partner, but of course there was a lack of belief in herself. There were some self-esteem issues going on, but I mean, it makes sense as to why. And there was some things that Jake was not upfront about that he should have been upfront about, because it just created a very sticky situation for Naya that I don't think it was fair for her to be in that position or that situation. But overall, I just thought that this was a very, very well done book, and one that I didn't expect to enjoy as much as I thought I was going to enjoy. Like, some of the content is dark, but I was really invested in their relationship, and Denise Williams really, really did a good job of that. So I'm looking forward to seeing what else she comes up with in the near future. And I don't know if I've said this, but I did end up giving this one 4 out of 5 stars. The next one that I have here is The Way of the House Husband by Koisuke Onna. I think I probably say, I need to learn how to say the mangaka's name. Like, I really do. But this is volume 2 of Way of the House Husband, and I gave this one 3.5 stars. I did not enjoy this one as much as the first one. Like I said, this is specifically just about a former like mob guy who was known as the Immortal Dragon, and he is now a house husband. So he's married, he's settled down, and it's really just vignettes of his life and just the things that he does on a day-to-day basis, and how his past like gangster life has influenced his current life. And I think that the jokes were better in the first volume than they were in this one. I still enjoyed it. There were some moments that I laughed. I think one of my favorite moments from this book was definitely when they were giving someone basil and the police thought it was like a drug deal. That was pretty funny to me. But I think that the humor in this one just wasn't as good as the first one, and I'm hoping that it doesn't continue to go downhill. Like, I'm really excited to read the third volume, but I'm hoping that we just get just a little bit more in the third volume than what we got in this one. The next book that I have here is Crosshairs by Catherine Hernandez. I got this one as an ARC from Entre Books, and this one came out on the 8th of December last year, so this one is already out if you want to check. But this is a book that takes place in a different version of Canada. I don't know, it's kind of hard to explain. And even when I wrote my review on Goodreads, I was like, I don't even know how to describe this book because it has science fiction elements to it, but it almost reads like it's literary science fiction. I don't even know if that's really a thing, but that's the way it reads. And this is about a cataclysmic environmental disaster that causes disparities in Canada, where anyone that is considered other, and when I say other, that means that you're not white, cisgendered, heterosexual, Protestant, Anglo-Saxon, like, you're not a WASP that's cisgendered and heterosexual, you are considered other. And these individuals are placed into these camps where they're working and it's for their benefit and they need to work and they're treated poorly. There are a lot of trigger warnings for this book. As a matter of fact, I'm going to bring up my review so I can give you the trigger warnings because there's a lot. There is specific use of a word as a slur that's often associated with the gay community, transphobia, racism, transphobic slurs, lynching, sexual abuse of a minor, emotional abuse, suicidal ideation, dead naming, death of a child, gang rape described but not on page. It covers a lot of different topics, especially performative activism and allyship, which are probably the highlights for me, and then also the difference between being a part of a marginalized group where you can hide your marginalizations and being a part of a marginalized group where you can't hide your marginalizations, which I'm going to talk about in another video. But just so you know, I ended up giving this one 4.5 stars. The next one that I have is one that I've been working on to finish for a while. I originally was going to read this one for Nonfiction November, and I started it and never got to it. I talked about this a little bit in my currently reading video, so I was like, okay, let me just go ahead and finish this one up. And that is They Called Us Enemy by George Takei, because I think that's how you say his last name, because in the graphic novel they were talking about his last name rhyming with okay, so it would be Takei, I believe. If I'm wrong, somebody please correct me again. So They Called Us Enemy is about George's experience and his family's experience living in Japanese internment camps, and it was a emotional read for me because I have known a little bit about Japanese internment camps, but it always fascinates me that this, once again, like a couple of the other books that I've talked about, this is not something that's typically taught in US history. So a lot of people in the United States probably are not even aware that this was a thing that happened. So it starts off talking about World War II and Pearl Harbor and how there were politicians who were key individuals, even some politicians that are highly revered to this day, who were key into signing in an order that moved thousands and thousands of Japanese Americans into internment camps. And George specifically talks about their experience in these internment camps, and it is horrible. And what's interesting is that George puts pieces of the puzzle together because his experience in the internment camps was from the perspective of a child. So a lot of the horrible things that they were actually going through, George was not actively aware because he was a child. So George and his family started off in one internment camp, and then they were moved to another internment camp where they lived until they were actually allowed to leave. But there were things that happened during their process that I was not aware of, like Close to the ending of the war and to their release, they were told that they could relinquish their American citizenship. And if they did so, that meant that they could stay in the camps longer and they would be returned to Japan, which was a trick because a lot of the families knew that once they left the camps, they literally had nowhere to go because the homes that they had paid for, that they had acquired, their businesses, all of that had been seized by the American government. So they had nothing to go back to. So it was such a tricky situation because it was like, well, if we want to stay safe here and buy ourselves more time, we would relinquish our American citizenship and they'll send us back to Japan. But for a lot of these families, this was right after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So at that point, what are they going back to? So sending them back to Japan was like sending them back to a country that wasn't even stabilized at the moment because they were dealing with so much of the after effect of death and tragedy related to the war. Of course, George and his family did end up staying in the United States. They ended up living like on Skid Row because they had nowhere to go and they had to work their way back up. And this is the expanded version, so I'm not as sure how far it goes into George's, like the original version. I'm not sure how far it goes into like what happens afterwards and George coming to understanding exactly what happened in the internment camps, because his father eventually has to explain to him like this is what happened, and he had to learn from his father's experience of like his father at one point was like, I'm not meeting Eleanor Roosevelt, and he couldn't understand why. And the point of this is to say that George makes this beautiful connection. He comes full circle at the end, and it's so crazy because I was just literally talking to my dad about this. We just had a conversation about this where George says that essentially because the United States has not taught this country, like the United States itself has not taught its citizens about the internment camps, history continuously has, like, it's repeated itself, in that you have to look at individuals. For example, like FDR was responsible for two things. FDR is very well known for getting us out of the Depression and creating all of this access to programs and plans to help with the Great Depression. But he's also responsible for sending thousands of Japanese Americans into internment camps. And what George's father was trying to explain is that's the beauty of this country, and that's the beauty of any human, is that you have to understand that these are not perfect beings and that they do a lot of wrong, but you have to tell both sides of the story, because when you don't tell both sides of the story, what ends up happening is that because one thing, the bad things are left out, history repeats itself. Great book. I actually haven't even marked it as read on Goodreads yet, but definitely a 5-star read for me. I really enjoyed it. I think it had a lot to say. I think it taught me a lot, and I hope more people have picked this one up. All right, so this is exactly why I wanted to do mid-month and final wrap up, because this is I talk a lot. I give reviews, basically individualized reviews of everything that I read. So the next one that I have here is Goldie, Vance, and the Hocus Pocus Hoax. This is the second book in the Goldie Vance series. This is a middle grade series that is based on the Goldie Vance comics. If you've never read them, they are pretty good. And this is by Lillian Rivera, and this specifically is about Goldie Vance coming across this whole magician's convention that happens, and then there's a mystery that of course occurs when magical items start to go missing, and Goldie is put on the case to find out what exactly is going on. This is a quick read. I think that it's really fast paced. It was just well written, well thought out. I think that it, like I said, is fast paced. It's a page turner, and I think that Goldie Vance goes through a lot of character development. There's one specific character that she doesn't get along with, and that's the son of Dr. Von Thurston, whose name is Derek. It's the name of the character. They don't get along, but I think that Goldie has to put some stuff into perspective to understand like why he behaves the way that he behaves, and at least it's a major character development for her. This is such a diverse cast of characters. Like I said, there is queer representation. I mean, there's diversity in terms of race in this book, and it was just fun. And the very end of this book actually has a comic book at the end, which I thought was really cool. So I definitely would recommend checking this out if you're looking for a middle grade mystery series. I know that I enjoyed it. I actually have the first book checked out as well because I did enjoy this enough. I gave this one 4 stars, so I really want to go back now and read the first one, and I low-key do need to reread the comics as well. All right, y'all, so that is it. That is my mid-month wrap-up. I know that this was long, but imagine if I would have waited until the end of the month again. Like, I like that I'm able to kind of talk my way through what I liked and what I didn't like about these books. I think that's super important to me as just a reviewer. So once again, if these still end up being too long, like I said, I may switch to the weekly format if I have the time to do that, or these just may end up having to be long videos. So we'll see how it goes. Anyway, let me know in the comment box below, what is the best book that you've read so far this month. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more content from me, click the subscribe button. And as always, if you're interested in following me on social media, that'll be down in the description box below. If you're interested in supporting my channel, the links will be down in the description box below, and I'll be back with another video soon.